Our next speaker will not only talk about the KPIs of our industry, but give also his estimates, which indicators we have to take into account for a sustainable future. Let us welcome together from the University of Arkansas, Professor Marty Matlock. The floor is yours, Professor.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Well, Dr. Randers challenged us before the break to change course. We have to change course, he says. And the data are clear, we have to change course. He also suggested that the evidence is also clear that governments are not at the helm in sustainability. And governments will not change course. So who can? I submit to you that the industry that sustains humanity today, agricultural production industry, will be the industry that changes the course for the future, working with conservation organizations who understand the complexity of our global systems and working with governments to implement good policy can change course. And that's what we're going to talk about today. In sustainability, there are three things we know. These things are true. Everything is connected. Everything is connected. Social, economic, ecological systems are all interconnected. And as our resource consumption increases in proportion to the availability of those resources, those connectivities get tighter, and they get tighter by the minute. We also know that everything is changing, and that rate of change is accelerating. Again, Dr. Randers' data are very clear. His projections and his assessment are very clear that our challenges of these rates of change mean that we have to act fast, but understanding how those connections interact with each other in periods of rapid change are difficult. We also understand this. We're all in this together. There can be no prosperous part of humanity without all of humanity participating. Even though we will always have challenges, we have to understand that our greatest destiny is in our common prosperity. We've all seen the data on our population growth rates. I want to give you a little perspective from my mentor, Dr. Norman Borlaug, called the father of the Green Revolution, and he always hated that term. He would say he was just simply a representative of an army of dedicated agricultural scientists who worked to try to ease the burden of starvation from humanity. When he accepted the Nobel Peace Prize in 1970, Norm said he didn't set out to solve the hunger issue, he set out to solve the poverty issue. Norm taught me that the greatest birth control on the planet is prosperity. Dr. Randers' data make that very clear. So as we look to our future with current fertility rates, 12 billion people in the next 40 years, we know that probably we will have less than that, between 8 and 10 billion, with some uncertainty according to the UN population data. But what we also know is what we do in the next 10 years will affect what happens in the next 40 years or even the next 100 years, because demographics are destiny. The number of women being born today will determine how many children are being born in 15 years. And that is the nature of the mathematics of population growth. Reducing population growth means bringing prosperity to humanity. Bringing prosperity to humanity means reducing population growth. They are intimately connected. You cannot do one without the other. Another thing I submit to you that is true is that when technologies and cultures collide, technology always prevails. Those cultures that do not adapt to technologies go extinct. We're all in this together. Anyone who's in the retail consumer packaged goods business understands that the 3 billion more people coming to dinner in the next 40 years aren't going to be from the global north. They're not going to be from around here. They're going to be from less developed regions. And that means that's where your customers are going to come from. Understanding that and understanding the consequences of customers coming from less developed regions means changing the way we do business. Jason Clay will be a speaker tomorrow afternoon, and you're honored to have Jason from the World Wildlife Fund here. the World Wildlife Fund issued September 30th their Living Planet Report for 2014. World Wildlife Fund frames the three pillars of sustainability this way: that within the ecological domain we have the social domain, and within the social domain we have the economic domain. These are not separated domains, they are nested domains. So when we talk about sustainability, we start with the ecological domain because everything within that is dependent upon it. Over the last 40 years, we've lost 39% of our terrestrial species. 39% gone. 76% of our freshwater species gone in the last 40 years. I'm 52 years old. This is benchmarked from when I was a 12-year-old boy playing in rivers and streams in Oklahoma. 76% of those freshwater species are now gone, as best we can tell, and 39% loss of marine species. The threats to those species comes predominantly from exploitation, 37%, habitat degradation, 31%, and habitat loss, 13%. Exploitation, hunting and fishing, is destroying our biological base upon which all life on this planet depends. So I would suggest that chickens and fish are our protein future. And I would suggest that the limitations with aquaculture will be overcome by our appetites and demand for those proteins. I also suggest that we can do things better. Because our challenge is there's just not any more earth left. 43% of Earth's surface is already used for agricultural production purposes, including pasture and grazing. The only arable land left is in the tropics, which are some of our most rich biodiverse lands left. Jason has taught me much. Jason Clay of the World Wildlife Fund has taught me much in understanding the interconnection between conservation and agriculture. And back in Chicago at the Center for Food Integrity a year or two ago, Jason made this presentation where he said there are persistent issues in sustainability and there are important issues. The persistent issues like locally grown, GMO crops, organic crops, and natural foods always come up, but they're not the important issues. The important issues are water use efficiency, soil erosion, soil organic carbon, land use change, and biodiversity loss. So when we talk about key performance indicators, this is what we're talking about. We know that meat consumption is on the rise. The FAO's projected expansion of meat consumption suggests that we're probably going to see a dramatic increase in poultry and pork production or consumption in the next 10 years. We also understand the benefits of animal agriculture. To our friends and colleagues who say we should just stop eating meat, I would suggest to you that animal agriculture represents one of the grand and greatest opportunities for prosperity multiplication in our most impoverished regions of the world. Animal agriculture accounts for 40% of gross domestic product, currently employs 1.3 billion people. Of the 880 million rural people living on less than $1 a day, the bottom billion of our planet, 70% are partially or completely dependent on livestock for their livelihoods and food security. And I would suggest that in many places where women cannot own land, they can own livestock. So livestock, the cow, the goats, become the bank for prosperity for the women in the communities. Global meat production is expected to more than double. Global milk production is almost going to double by 2050 to meet demand. And the challenges, of course, we know. The challenges are many. They come from greenhouse gas production, from feed consumption, from water production, from water contamination. Let's talk about greenhouse gas emissions as one of those global fungible issues that occurs all around the planet from each individual place. Roughly, according to FAO, 7.1 gigatons of CO2 equivalent gases or greenhouse gases are emitted to the atmosphere from livestock a year. 41% of that's from beef, 20% from dairy. So ruminants represent 60% of that CO2 emissions. FAO suggested in their analysis that increasing forage digestibility and digestible forage intake will generally reduce greenhouse gas emissions. You know that. This is your industry. Rumen fermentation and stored manure. You also know that dietary lipids are effective in reducing greenhouse gas, especially methane emissions. That supplementations with small amounts of concentrated feed can also increase productivity. That's from the FAO. I would suggest to you that we have a range of key sustainability challenges in agriculture beyond greenhouse gases. In order to meet the projected demand for food, feed, fiber, and fuel from the land in the next 40 years, we will have to increase production output per year from 50 to 100%. Now, that's globally, and we know that there are challenges in distribution, challenges in infrastructure, challenges in genetics in many parts of the world. So if we can't raise this production globally, that means that the global north, the US and Europe, must increase production by even more. If we want to preserve biodiversity, other living things on this planet, these are things we depend on. These are not just nice things. This is the ecosystem upon which all life depends. We have to freeze the footprint of agriculture. This is Jason's statement, his claim. We have to freeze the footprint of agriculture. Thus, yield, output per area, must more than double in the next 40 years in the US and Europe. But, again, following on Dr. Rander's wise analysis, energy scarcity will drive innovation, or it will drive you out of production. Water scarcity will limit production because you just can't innovate out of drought. There's another issue with agricultural sustainability that I would like to talk to you about. This is not just a global response to declining resources. The food supply chain understands that it's bad for business to kill your customers with your product. It's bad for business to sell unsafe products. It's just not good business. That the food supply chain must have safe, secure, and stable products in the supply chain. That means understanding the supply chain from the field all the way to the fork. Understanding that supply chain means knowing where your products come from, where the products that make your products come from. And I would also submit to you that this is one of the reasons that the Chinese consumers like European and American food. It's because it's safe, secure. So how do we change course? You know, sustainability is not that complicated. It's just hard. Sustainability is continuous improvement. It's the process we've been using in industry and in business for hundreds of years to make things better. We define, we measure, we implement. It's not complicated, it's just hard. We define sustainability for the enterprise. What does it mean for us to be sustainable? Then we define the key performance indicators. That's the stuff we care about. Then we select the metrics, the things we can measure for those key performance indicators. Then we get about implementing the strategy for improving those key performance indicators. We have to set goals first. We benchmark them, we set goals, and we develop a strategy. And then we implement the strategy. We measure, assess, and report, and we adapt the strategy to improve outcomes. This process is not complicated, and we do it in our businesses every day. What makes this different than what we do in our businesses every day is that this process has to be expanded to include those things that we did not normally consider to be within our business domain, upstream and downstream of our supply chains, social and environmental metrics that maybe we didn't consider as part of our business domain or business provenance. Now they are. We have to consider them as part of our safety, security, and stability of our supply chain. And that means we also have to be transparent about the goals we set, the benchmarks we adopt, the strategies we use, and our results. And when we do not succeed in making things better, we have to step back, admit our mistakes, in fact, explore our mistakes, and do it again and again and again, because you are never, ever sustainable. You're always becoming more sustainable. It just takes one disruption to upend everything you thought you knew about sustainability in your system. That's why you have to expand your gaze beyond what we have normally considered in our business practices. I worked with Field to Market. It's an alliance for sustainable agriculture in the United States That is a multi-stakeholder initiative that includes agricultural producers, agribusiness, consumers, consumer representatives, retailers, conservation organizations. And we define sustainability using an optimistic version of the Brundtland Commission definition, meeting the needs of the present while improving the ability of future generations to meet their needs. My grandfather, Frank Shell, was a Mennonite farmer in Oklahoma, and he taught us that you leave the wood stack a little taller. You leave the soil a little better. The agricultural ethic is not just to do no harm, it's to make things better. That has been the agricultural ethic across the land, across landscapes for any multi-generational operation, and that is the essence of sustainability thinking. So that means we have to increase productivity to meet future food, feed, fiber, and fuel demands. We have to improve the environment, but we also have to improve the social and economic well-being of our agricultural communities. Those are our responsibilities in sustainability. Process matters. Key performance indicators are the things we measure to inform decisions. They should be outcomes-based. They should be science-driven. They should be technology-neutral. And they should be transparent to the public so everyone understands what we are doing and why. I had the opportunity at the Global Food and Feed Congress a year ago, April, in South Africa, beautiful country, by the way. I fell in love with South Africa. To go on a photo safari, and we stopped and watched this giraffe that was down in a riparian area with some woodlands with some zebras and gazelles, and this mother giraffe, her ears perked up, and she started walking up to this little ledge and was very interested. And what do you think the zebras and gazelles did? They skedaddled. They went the other way. She came this way, they went that way. Why? Because she saw what they didn't see. 5 lions in the bush, in the veld. 5 lions. Oh, and they're there. They're there over here in this upper corner. You see them. Let's see, right there. See? Now, the giraffe is an allegory, is an example of a key performance indicator. If you're a zebra, you don't need to see the lions. In fact, by the time you see the lions, you're probably lion food. That's too late. You see the giraffe, and you know what to do. You can make a directionally correct decision. You can change course. And you change course, and you move the opposite direction the giraffe moved and looked, right? That's what a key performance indicator needs to be. Simple, clearly defining outcomes. The metrics are the lions in the bush, and maybe you need to measure those directly. Maybe measuring them is too expensive or too risky. But you'd better understand your key performance indicators and get them right, otherwise you're lion food. Setting goals is one of the challenges I've been working on with companies, with industries, with organizations for the last 10 years, because goal setting seems simple, but it's not. The process of setting goals requires that we understand what kind of goals we are setting. When we talk about goals, we need to understand that goals are hierarchical. We can have aspirational goals, which have long-term, broad implications. We're going to reduce greenhouse gases. That's an aspirational goal. That is a directionally correct fixed point on the horizon that we can navigate towards. We can set our course based upon aspirational goals. And then we can use that aspirational goals to set strategic goals. We will reduce greenhouse gases to 2010 levels in the next 5 years and to 1994 levels in the next 10 years. That would be a strategic goal. It's numeric. It has consequences with benchmarks. Those 2 goals are products of vision. That dashed line represents a demarcation, a separation, though, between what should be public and should reside in the public domain in multi-stakeholder initiatives with many people engaging, and what should be private, what should reside with management. Tactical and operational goals, how we achieve our strategic goals, should be the domain of the enterprise and not of the NGO, the conservation organization, the advocacy group. We should, if we're wise, be transparent about how we're doing that, but we should own those processes. And those can be proprietary if they provide competitive advantage. But we can still share in the aspirational goals. And frankly, as long as we all agree on our aspirational goals and the processes we use to achieve our tactical and operational goals that support the strategic goals, if we can all agree that the strategic goals are good, how we get there belongs to you, not to the larger stakeholder group. This is an important distinction because that defines who gets to say. So as we look at trends, benchmarks, and goals over time, one of the challenges we have with any metric, and if we look at this metric, we're going from low is bad, high is good. We'll think of this as a percent efficiency, 0% to 100% efficiency. And we all know that as you start approaching the top levels of any efficiency process, you start getting diminishing returns. We all understand that. So let's assume that we're on this line somewhere and we decide we're going to set 2000 as our benchmark year. And we're going to set a goal of making certain proportional improvements each decade after that. And we're going to report and we're going to be engaged in that process. In many sustainability initiatives, what we see emerging are certification criteria. Certification criteria are basically compliance reporting documents. What they provide is a minimum acceptable performance level, which may or may not make things better. Now, we all understand that we need to all start from a common place, and that there are behaviors below which are not acceptable in our arena of practice. But we also understand that we shouldn't penalize organizations, communities, countries that are starting behind other countries. So we have to put these certification processes in context. And this is frankly why I do not like certification programs. This is why you, industry, should own your destiny with sustainability by setting your own goals, benchmarking your products, benchmarking your process, and defining your outcomes. But remember, we're out of time, folks. The rate of change in the Anthropocene, the era of human domination of the biosphere, is accelerating. This is the period that anthropologists call the Great Acceleration. We are out of time. So how are we going to move the curve? Again, Jason Clay. I borrowed this from Jason. I've worked with him for 5, 6, 10 years, and much of what I know comes from Jason. You'll see him tomorrow. We move the curve by thinking about the entire enterprise. And if we look at this as a simple metric for agricultural production, soil erosion. And we know that we have very good producers on the left end of this curve, and we have not so good producers on the right end of the curve. And we have an average, this red line. In the United States in 2010 for soybeans, 0.131 tons of soil were lost per bushel on average. We know. Let's work with those producers on the far right-hand side, and let's make them better. And in so doing, we move the curve. And in moving the curve, we change course. So let's talk about a multi-stakeholder initiative, an example of this. Field to market membership includes Unilever, BASF, Bunge, Cargill, Walmart, World Wildlife Fund, the Nature Conservancy, World Resources Institute. You get the picture. Field to market, as a multi-stakeholder initiative, worked to develop for row crop agriculture in the United States these key performance indicators. And has benchmarked these key performance indicators, and here's an example of the benchmark for soybeans. Using 2000 as a benchmark year, in this radar diagram, we can see that the red line in the middle represents the most recent year, a 5-year average, 2007 to 2011, benchmarked to 2000, that across all of these metrics, we're getting better. It's not good enough, we're not done yet, but this is an example of being able to identify where we have made progress and where we have much more work to do, where we are on that curve. The science of analyzing these systems is relatively straightforward. It's called life cycle assessment. Life cycle assessment is an accounting process where you inventory all the stuff coming in and all the stuff going out in a process. You put all the processes together and you add up all the inputs and all the outputs, and you can figure out what's going on in the system. So if you figure that you have a unit process with inputs from nature, outputs to nature, inputs from other processes and outputs. You have 2 raw materials to make a product. You have all these unit processes. Now you have to be careful where you draw your boundaries, like any accounting system. So you have to have standards to make sure you can do comparative measurements. The boundaries matter, but in the process, this allows us to make some assessments of benchmarks. I've been working with the National Pork Board of the United States to assess carbon footprint for U.S. swine production. And we found that usually about a serving, a 12-ounce serving of pork produces requires 2.48 pounds of CO2 equivalent. So we find that out. What does that tell us? Not much. How do you make things better? How do you change course? Well, we got to figure out where it's coming from. So we analyze the sources. And we see that the sow barn, the finishing barn, processing, packaging, retail, and consumption all contribute to CO2 emissions. But you can see where most of it's coming from. Unpacking that, we see that live animal production, manure, feed, and piglets represent the largest, and really it's manure and feed represent the largest elements of greenhouse gas reduction. That's where you should start. If you want to reduce and have the biggest impact, that's where you should start. Because it's all about improving feed and reducing manure. Improving effective feed utilization, conservation of feed into product, reduces the environmental metrics. Feed mixture optimization is a key element for enhancing sustainability of agriculture, of animal sustainability, nutrient digestibility, gut function, immune systems. Sustainability is not complicated. Sustainability means increasing efficiency. It means decreasing impacts. It means understanding the impact across all the systems and the connectivity of all systems. It means optimizing your processes not for profit, but for long-term persistence, to build resilience into your system, because things are changing, and they're changing faster than we understand. We can change course. The process for changing course is what we've been doing. We just have to do it faster, with more determination, more focused, and more collaboration. Thank you.
So, Marty, thank you very much.
It was my pleasure.
Presentation. Thank you so much. Thanks a lot. Questions after this positive presentation? There are ways to overcome the issues. I think there's the question over there. Please bring the microphone. Please raise your hand again. Here you go.
Did I not challenge you enough?
Here you go.
Thank you, Professor Matlock, for a very interesting presentation, and an optimistic presentation. I disagree and say that sustainability is not simple. It's a bit like democracy. It's an ideal that we all try to attain, but as I think you said in your presentation, you've just got to have something go wrong, and then the whole sustainability question changes. So how do we get around this, from this simple ideal that we all aspire to, but something that I suspect we will never ever really attain?
The reason I say sustainability is not complicated, it's just hard, is because we hide behind the complications. When we know most of the things we need to do right now, they're pretty apparent to us. Dr. Randers gave us a list of things we need to do right now. We know what we need to do right now. We just won't do it because they're hard. I don't like hiding behind the veil of complexity when we know the things we have to do. Now, in reality, everything's connected and everything's changing, and that means the world is very complicated. That means in order to build resilience within the enterprise, you'd better understand the interconnectivities and the changes. And you'd better adapt for them, and you'd better be willing and able to manage for them. And that's what a sustainable enterprise will be. An organization that is not making decisions based upon market value today, because that could evaporate tomorrow, but an organization that is making decisions based upon 5, 10, 20-year projections in their supply chain, and anticipating and making changes now to either ensure and stabilize their supply chain upstream, or to modify their supply chain so they won't have the negative impacts. That's what a sustainable enterprise is. So I yield to your suggestion that yes, in fact, it is complicated, but I suggest that we have to provide a more positive message if we want to motivate change. Because unfortunately, as Dr. Borlaug taught me, it's not enough to be right. It's not good enough to know the answer. We have to convince people to change. Convincing people to change is hard. Convincing people to change, though, is a science. And we have to start with simple things because we are ultimately simple people.
There's a question over there.
My question is going a bit in the same direction. You have in your multi-stakeholder organization, you have a lot of companies on the stock exchange. How does KPIs, which are going in the direction of sustainability, with long-term investment for the future, fits with the pressure of quarterly results and paying out of dividends?
That's of course the tyranny of the free enterprise system, right, of capitalism. The question is, do we want to exchange short-term gains for long-term gains? And I would suggest to you that there's always pressure to do that, and that's where leadership matters. Companies that are well-led have boards of directors that understand that short-term gains benefit the few, long-term gains are what benefit society. This is why the only real hope we have to move to change course is going to come from industry leadership. Industry leadership that understands and recognizes that short-term gains are not the solution to long-term prosperity.
Any question? There's a question right here in the first row. Right here.
Hi. We've been talking about, high consumption of protein, and we always talk about meat, and we are talking about chicken being the winner. What about eggs?
Eggs and milk. Eggs and milk are incredible products because the animal persists for a time, and continues to give for a time. So certainly, I would put eggs and milk and when we talk about chickens being the winner, eggs are part of that. Absolutely part of that. And that's the only edge that chickens have over fish. While fish eggs are nice, they sell very high prices. So I would suggest to you that yes, fish or chicken wins, and the eggs are part of why they win.
Okay, thanks.
There's one more question over there.
A nice presentation. Just following on your theme of simplicity, messaging is really important. Isn't it important for agriculture to very actively differentiate the difference between methane produced from carbon that's already in play versus sequestered carbon?
It is, but that gets to be complicated fairly quickly. I think the better thing yes, and the fact is cows are eating grass that was in the atmosphere, in some cases, days ago. But the challenge is they're putting that CO2 from the atmosphere that is captured by the grass back up as methane, which is 32 times more impactful in the environment than CO2. That's one of the challenges. That's why, but methane is methanogenesis is a natural process happening in every swamp in the country, and in the tundra and other places. So context matters. I think risk, impact, and benefit are the way we characterize this. But we can also do what we can do to reduce those impacts. We can do better than we're doing now. You are working to do better than you're doing now. And here's the argument I make to our dairy producers and to our cattlemen. If you're losing carbon as methane from the rumen, you're losing carbon to the animal. And you usually pay for that carbon if it's feed. And so that's not a good thing. You want a healthy rumen. I'm not a rumen ecologist. It's a very complicated subject, and we'll hear much more about that this week. That's why this subject is so important. But what I would suggest to you, though, is that we have to put these in context in a way that the community can understand, so we get away from cows bad, soybeans good as protein sources, that we get into a much more complex understanding of our interconnected diet requirements.
think we still have one.
One question
One
is
question?
fine. One final one.
There's one question over there.
Leaving out the complexity of deciding which animal-derived protein is better in terms of carbon footprint, is there a metric that allows you to say, in the future, a certain number of grams animal-derived protein in terms of grams is sustainable on a per capita basis?
We can do the math and divide protein by population, and you could do that, but it doesn't. But we don't eat based upon averages. We eat based upon culture, based upon our identity, based upon our activities, based upon our lifestyle. I think the better way to think about this is how do we, I think Michael Pollan gets this right, how do we balance our understanding of our diets with our history, with our culture, and with our enjoyment of life, which is ultimately what we're here for, right? It is this happiness index, and understanding that we don't have to have a 32-ounce steak every evening. I grew up in Oklahoma with steak for breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You don't have to have that to be happy, but I do want a steak once in a while. Does that mean that I'm bad? No. We have to make the message more about diversifying our diet, understanding the impacts of our food, and managing those impacts as best we can. As long as we're digging up coal out of the ground and burning it, I would suggest for fuel, as long as we are driving our cars with 250 to 500 horsepower under the hood with one person from 40 miles to and back from work, I would suggest that none of these other metrics are really going to drive change. Let's, just like we did with greenhouse gases for pigs, let's think about where in our civilization our greenhouse gases are coming from. Agriculture is an important part of it. Agricultural communities, agricultural industries can lead the way to doing our part. The more important thing that we'll do is it will set an example, if not shame the other industries, I hope, into also engaging likewise. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a great conclusion of your presentation.